Picture a castle built for comfort turning slowly into a coffin. Picture a moat frozen at the edges, a great hall hung with black cloth from floor to rafter, so that no light bounces off any surface. A scaffold built low and wide so the crowd inside the room can see everything. Add the smell of beeswax candles burning in daylight because the windows have been shuttered on purpose. Add the sound of a woman's rosary beads clicking under her sleeve where the guards cannot see them. Add 12 armed men standing so close together that their breath fogs into a single cloud. That's Fotheringhay Castle in February of 1587. A minor fortress in the flat, wet middle of England, built for nobody in particular, about to become the most watched building on earth for exactly one morning. You're not supposed to be anywhere near it. That's the thing you keep telling yourself, standing in the cold apothecary shed behind the kitchens with a mortar full of storax resin going sticky under your pestle, while somewhere on the other side of 2 stone walls and a locked oak door, something is happening that you are specifically, deliberately being kept from seeing. Your master has told you 3 times this week, in 3 different tones of voice, that your work today is spices and wax and nothing else, that you are to stay in this shed until you are sent for, that whatever you hear you keep grinding. He has not told you why. He does not need to. Everyone in this household has known for 6 days what the 14 men riding in from London on the 4th of February actually came to deliver, wrapped in a leather dispatch case sealed with the Queen of England's own signet. Your hands already know something is wrong before your ears do. That's usually how it goes. The pestle catches a rhythm and your fingers keep it going almost on their own. Storax and myrrh and a little cassia bark ground fine enough to pass through muslin. And underneath that steady grinding sound you become aware of another sound arriving from very far away and getting closer, muffled by stone, by distance, by the thickness of a castle built to keep sound in it as much as to keep enemies out. A drum. One drum, beaten slow. The kind of beat that isn't music. That's only there to mark time for men walking somewhere they don't want to walk. Then nothing. Then a long, long nothing that stretches out so far you start counting your own pestle strokes just to have something to measure it against. 40, 60, 91. Then the sound that you will spend the rest of your life trying and failing to describe to people who weren't there. Not sharp, not clean. A wet, heavy sound with a metal edge somewhere inside it, and underneath that, for one terrible half-second, something that might have been a voice. Master Ashby's hand comes down on your shoulder so hard the mortar nearly tips. "Keep grinding," he says. His voice doesn't shake, which is somehow worse than if it had. The pestle doesn't stop, Robin. Not for anything. Not today. You keep grinding. Your name is Robin Fenn. You're 15 years old, and you've been apprenticed to Master Thomas Ashby, barber surgeon of Fotheringhay village, for the better part of 2 years. Under ordinary circumstances your work is bleeding farmers, pulling rotten teeth for a penny, setting the occasional broken arm, and mixing plasters that smell so foul the patients sometimes recover just to get away from the smell. These are not ordinary circumstances. 6 days ago, 2 grim-faced men from the castle came down to your master's shop on the high street and told him without much ceremony that his skills were required up at Fotheringhay, not for the living, for afterward. Somebody with knowledge of anatomy, spicery, and the handling of a corpse that would need to survive an unknown length of time before it could be properly buried, because nobody yet knew when, or even whether that burial would be allowed to happen at all. Your master has embalmed exactly one body before in his life, a wealthy wool merchant 3 winters back, and he has told you privately, quietly, in the voice he uses when he actually means what he's saying, that he has no earthly idea how you properly preserve the corpse of an anointed queen, because nobody in England has had to do it under quite these conditions before. Kings and queens usually die where their household can bury them the next week with proper ceremony. This queen is going to lie unburied for longer than anyone in that castle currently understands, caught in a limbo created by a cousin 400 miles away in London who cannot decide, even now, even after signing the warrant, whether she actually wants this dead body in the ground or not. You remember the day the London men first arrived 6 days back, with a clarity that has nothing to do with any single dramatic event, and everything to do with the particular way ordinary life simply stopped, all at once, like a wheel catching in a rut. You were sweeping the shop floor when the first riders came through the village, 14 of them, good horses, good cloaks, moving at the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who know that whatever business brings them here outranks anyone they might inconvenience along the way. Your master came to the door to watch them pass, wiping his hands on his apron, and you noticed that every other shopkeeper on the high street had done exactly the same thing. A whole row of tradesmen standing in their doorways in near silence, watching 14 strangers ride toward the castle, with the particular held breath of a village that already suspects, without being told, exactly what kind of errand requires 14 armed men and a sealed dispatch case. "That'll be the warrant," your master said, so quietly you almost missed it. God help us all. That'll be the warrant. Finally come. You didn't understand, not fully, not that first afternoon. You knew in the vague way any apprentice knows things about matters far above his station, that the Scottish Queen had been kept at Fotheringhay for some months, that she had been tried the previous autumn in the very hall where you would one day help wrap her body, that the whole business had something to do with plots against the English Queen's own life, letters found, ciphers broken, a trial conducted with the outcome apparently decided well before the evidence was even properly heard. You knew these things the way you knew that the earth was round or that Bethlehem was somewhere far to the east. True, presumably, but not the sort of truth that touched your actual daily life of bleeding bowls and as market day tooth-pulling. That changed over the following 6 days, with a speed that left you feeling as though the ground itself had shifted underfoot. 2 days after the London men arrived, your master was summoned to the castle for the first time, not yet for the work that would eventually consume the whole household's attention, but simply to be interviewed, assessed, questioned closely by a stern commissioner about his training, his experience with the dead, his discretion, and this detail struck you as strange at the time, though you understand it rather better now, his religion, which he answered plainly and without hesitation as sound and Protestant, a fact that seemed to satisfy the commissioner rather more than any question about his actual surgical skill. They want a man they can trust not to talk, your master told you that evening, sitting by the shop's small fire with his supper going cold in front of him, untouched. And a man they can trust not to weep over her either, I'd wager, though they'd never say so plainly. There's men in that castle who'd sooner see her rot unmourned than buried with proper rites, Robin, and there's men in that same castle who'd weep themselves blind if they thought nobody was watching. I don't much fancy being caught looking like either kind, in front of London men with lists in their hands. You asked him because you were 15 and had not yet learned the particular caution that governs how a grown man speaks about matters of state in his own home, whether he thought the Queen deserved to die. He was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick rather than answering directly. And when he finally spoke, his voice had the careful, deliberate flatness of a man choosing every word as though it might later be repeated back to him by someone with the power to do him harm for it. "I think," he said, "that it is not given to a barber surgeon in a village of 400 souls to have an opinion on such things that matters one whit to anyone with the power to act on it, one way or the other. I think what I am asked to do, when the time comes, is to do my work as well and as decently as I know how, regardless of what anyone else in that castle believes about the rightness of the thing that brought the work about. That is the only opinion I intend to carry into that building, Robin, and I would strongly advise you to carry the very same one, and no other, whatever your own young heart happens to feel." You have thought about that answer many times since, turned it over the way you would eventually turn over a small dark bead between your fingers on sleepless nights years later, and you have come, slowly, to understand it as one of the wisest things your master ever taught you, though it took you the better part of your own working life to fully appreciate why. There is a kind of steadiness available to a person doing careful, necessary work in the middle of events too large and too politically fraught for that person to have any real influence over, a steadiness that comes precisely from narrowing your attention down to the work itself, the wax and the linen and the exact pressure of your own two hands, rather than the enormous churning machinery of kings and warrants and religious wars turning somewhere far above your head. It does not make the work easy. It makes it possible. On the 4th day, your master sent you into Peterborough on an errand that, at the time, felt like simple practical necessity, and that you understand now, in hindsight, as a small act of foresight on his part. He needed spices beyond what the village apothecary kept in ordinary stock, myrrh and aloes and a particular grade of cassia bark suited to preservation work rather than everyday physic, and the only reliable supplier of such quantities lay a half-day's ride distant in the cathedral town. You made the journey on the back of the shop's aging grey mare, your satchel packed with coin, and a written list in your master's careful hand. And you remember the ride itself less for anything remarkable in the countryside. Flat fen country in February offers precious little to remark upon. All bare hedgerows and standing water in the ditches and rooks, working over stubble fields under a sky the colour of old pewter, than for the strange conversation you had with the spice merchant himself. Once your errand there was concluded. He was an older man, heavy-set, with the particular weathered patience of someone who has spent decades weighing out small quantities of expensive things to customers who always suspect, usually wrongly, that they're being cheated on the scale. He asked, once he'd bundled your purchases and taken your master's coin, what a village surgeon's boy needed with quite so much myrrh and aloes all at once, and you told him, because you had not yet learned the particular caution your master would soon be teaching you rather more forcefully, that it was for embalming work, up at the castle. His hands went still on the counter. "Fotheringhay," he said, not a question. "Aye." He was quiet a moment, looking at you with an expression you couldn't quite place, something between pity and a kind of grim, private satisfaction that you didn't understand until much later, once you'd learned more about the particular sympathies that ran deep and mostly unspoken through certain corners of that part of England, communities that had never entirely made their peace with the old religion being torn up by its roots within living memory. "There's men in this town," he said, low, glancing toward the door as though checking for listeners even in his own shop, who tell you plainly, if they thought it safe to say, that whatever crime she's meant to have committed, a trial got up specially to find against her, in a hall she wasn't even permitted proper counsel to defend herself in. Is no trial a decent Englishman ought to feel easy about. But you're a boy, and you've a master to answer to, and none of that is any business of yours to carry home with you. Take your spices, lad, and mind you keep whatever you see up at that castle to yourself, whatever it turns out to be. There's a great deal of feeling running under the surface of this whole business in towns like this one, and it does a young apprentice no good at all to be caught carrying tales about it in either direction. You rode back to Fotheringhay with his warning sitting uneasily alongside your satchel of spices, and you understood, by the time you reached the village again in the last grey light of the afternoon, that you had just been given, by a stranger who owed you nothing, roughly the same advice your own master had already given you 2 nights before, in different words but with exactly the same underlying caution, that whatever you were about to witness, up at that castle, belonged to a category of knowledge too large and too dangerous for a boy your age to handle carelessly, and that the only safe way to carry it was quietly and mostly alone. That's the position you're standing in, grinding storax into powder, while the drum stops and the silence stretches and then breaks. The apothecary shed has one small window, high up, glazed with a pane so thick and green with age you can only tell day from night by it, not see anything useful. You've spent 6 days in this shed with sacks of spice, blocks of beeswax, coils of fine linen bandage, a chest of surgical tools your master keeps locked when he's not using them, and the particular cold that comes from a building with a stone floor and no proper hearth. Your hand has been perpetually raw all week, chapped at the knuckles from handling resin in the cold, and there's a split at the corner of your thumbnail that catches on everything and makes you wince every time you forget about it and grip something too hard. You grip the pestle too hard now. Outside, past the shed, past the kitchen yard, past the low wall separating the service buildings from the castle proper, something has just finished happening in the great hall that will be talked about in every country in Europe within the month. You know this the way you know the shape of a storm before it arrives, from pressure rather than evidence. The air in Fotheringhay has felt wrong for 6 days, tight and expectant, servants moving through corridors with their shoulders up around their ears, conversation stopping the second a stranger's footstep sounds in the passage. Master Ashby has gone very still beside you, listening to something you can't hear, or maybe just listening to the quiet itself. Then he exhales, long through his nose, and picks up his own tools. They'll send for us within the hour, he says. The body doesn't keep on its own account, Robin. Cold as it is, it still doesn't keep. We need the wax soft enough to work, but not so soft it won't hold. Check it. You check it. Your fingers press a shallow dent into the wax block and it springs back slow, which your master has taught you means it's close to right. You add a little more, work it between your palms until the ache in your fingers becomes a kind of company, something familiar to hold on to instead of the thing you both just heard through 2 stone walls. Master, you say, because you have to say something. Was that? Yes, he says, before you can finish the question, and that's all he says. The messenger comes for you both perhaps 40 minutes later. Not one of the London men, but a castle servant you half recognise, a groom named Davy, who has clearly been crying and is clearly furious with himself for it, wiping his face with the back of a glove that leaves a smear of horse grease across his cheek. He doesn't look either of you in the eye. They want the surgeon, he says, and the boy, if he's got steady hands, They'll not let anyone else near the room yet. Sir Amyas wants it done quiet, and done quick. Sir Amyas Paulet is the Queen's jailer, has been for a year and a half. A Puritan gentleman with a face permanently set in the expression of a man smelling something faintly unpleasant that he's too polite to mention. You've seen him exactly twice, both times from a safe distance, both times feeling as though his eyes had gone through you like a blade through cheese, without him actually looking at you at all. The idea that he specifically wants you, a 15-year-old apprentice with resin under his fingernails, anywhere near this business sits in your stomach like a swallowed stone. Your master picks up the chest of tools. You gather the wax, the spices wrapped tight in oiled cloth, a coil of the fine linen, and follow him out into the yard. The cold hits you first, the way it always does, but there's something under the cold today that wasn't there yesterday. A smell, faint, drifting from the direction of the hall, that your body recognizes before your mind wants to admit it. Iron, wet iron, and under it the particular sourness of fear sweat from dozens of people who have all been standing too close together in one room for too long. You've smelled blood before, plenty of it, from your master's bleeding bowls and from farm slaughter and from the occasional brawl outside the tavern on market day. You have never smelled this much of it at once, carried on cold air, mixing with wood smoke and wet stone and the greasy tallow smoke of 200 candles all burning down at the same time in a room built to hold maybe 60 people comfortably. Davy leads you not toward the great hall itself, but around the side, toward a smaller door that opens onto the passage running past the Queen's own apartments, the room she's lived in, more or less as a prisoner, for the last 5 months. 2 guards stand at this door who were not standing there yesterday. They look at you both for a long moment before one of them steps aside. "Not the hall," Davy says. Low, walking fast now like he wants this errand finished. They've taken her through to her own chamber already. Quicker that way, out of sight of the household staring. The corridor is cold and dim, lit by a single lamp, and it smells of the same wet iron. Stronger now, mixed with something sweetish that you don't have a name for yet, but that your master's face tells you he recognizes and wishes he didn't. He walks a half step ahead of you, and you notice, the way you notice everything too sharply right now, that his knuckles are white around the strap of the tool chest. At the door to what you will later learn was her privy chamber, a man in the black and silver livery of the London Commission stops you both with a raised hand. "Surgeon Ashby?" "Aye." "You'll do exactly as you're told in there and nothing more. Nothing is to be touched that isn't put directly into your hands. You understand?" "I understand. The boy stays close to you. He doesn't wander this room. Nobody wanders this room today." Your master glances back at you, just once, and in that glance is something you've never seen from him before in 2 years of watching him lance boils and set bones, without so much as a flinch. Not fear, exactly. More like a man bracing his shoulder against a door he already knows is going to be heavier than he can properly manage, and deciding to push anyway because there's nobody else standing behind him to do it. "Steady hands, Robin," he murmurs, so quiet only you can hear it. "That's all they need from you today. Steady hands and a shut mouth." Then the door opens, and you go in. The first thing that hits you is the cold, which is strange, because you have just come in from outside where it should by all sense be colder, but this room has a different quality of cold to it, the kind that settles into a space when every window has been shut and every fire let die down on purpose, because somebody decided a warm room was the wrong thing to have right now. The second thing that hits you is the candlelight. Dozens of tapers burning at once, their flames all leaning the same direction from some draught you can't locate, throwing shadows up the tapestried walls that move even when nobody in the room is moving. The third thing is her. She has been laid on a low table near the hearth, wrapped already in a length of coarse billiard cloth someone grabbed in haste, because there was apparently no dignity available in the moment itself, only speed, only the desperate need to get her out of that hall and away from 200 staring witnesses as quickly as human hands could manage it. Two women stand near the table, and you recognise them without being told, because everyone in the castle knows their faces by now. Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, the Queen's own ladies, who were in that hall with her at the end and who look, both of them, like they have aged a decade in the space of 1 hour. Jane Kennedy's hands are shaking so badly that the linen cloth she's holding trembles like something alive. Neither woman looks up when you enter. Neither woman seems entirely aware that anyone has entered at all. Your master sets down the tool chest with exaggerated care, the way you set things down in a room where a sudden noise feels like it would be a kind of violence, and steps toward the table. "My lady," he says to Jane Kennedy, not to the body, is a voice pitched soft and level, the same voice he uses on frightened children before he lances an abscess. "I am sent to prepare the Queen's body against burial. I need your help if you're able to give it, and I promise you I will handle her with every courtesy this room allows." Jane Kennedy looks up at him then. Her eyes are red-rimmed but perfectly dry, the eyes of a woman who has already done all her crying and gone somewhere past it into a kind of terrible clarity. She would want it done properly, she says. She spoke of it days ago. She said she did not fear the block, only that her body be treated with some decency after, since she doubted anyone in this kingdom would trouble to grant her decency before. Your master nods, once, like a man accepting a commission rather than receiving comfort. Then we'll see it done. What follows is work. That's the thing you will tell yourself, over and over, in the hours and years to come, when your mind tries to turn this into something other than work. It was work, methodical and slow and exact. And work is a thing hands know how to do even when the rest of you does not know how to feel about doing it. Your master unwraps the billiard cloth with a care that surprises you, folding each layer back rather than pulling, and you busy your own hands with the things he needs from you, warming the wax slightly at the small brazier that has been permitted in the room for exactly this purpose, threading the fine needle he'll use, laying out the linen strips in the order he taught you to lay them out for any body, noble or common, because a body is a body when it comes to what preserves it, and what doesn't. Your hands learn things that night that no amount of grinding simples in a cold shed could have taught you. The wax, warmed just enough at the little brazier, takes on a particular give under your fingers, softer than beeswax left cold but still holding its shape once pressed, and you learn to test it the way your master taught you, a shallow dent pressed with one knuckle, watching how slowly or quickly it springs back. Too soft and it will slump before morning, too stiff and it will crack. The moment the coffin is jostled on the coming journey nobody yet knows the length of, the linen, when you unroll it from its tight coil, releases a faint dry smell of the lavender it's been stored with, incongruous and almost sweet against the heavier smells filling the rest of the room, and you find your fingers, without quite meaning to, lingering an extra half-second on that clean lavender smell each time you unroll a fresh length, a small private mercy stolen from a room that offers precious few of them. The spice mixture itself has a weight and a texture entirely its own, coarse against your palm when you first measure it out, growing finer and more fragrant the longer you work it between your fingers before packing it, in careful measured pinches into the folds your master directs you toward. Myrrh first, dark and resinous and faintly bitter on the air, then the paler, sharper scent of aloes, then last of all the warm, almost sweet note of cassia bark ground fine as flour. The three smells layering over one another in a way that reminds you, absurdly, of nothing so much as your mother's kitchen at Christmas-tide, warm spice and careful measured quantities, except that here the measuring is done not for a feast, but against the slow, patient work of decay, and the quantities matter rather more than any recipe you've ever handled before. The body itself has a weight under your hands that you're entirely unprepared for, despite 2 years of handling patients living and, on rare occasion, dead. It is not simply heavy the way an unconscious person is heavy, all loose, unhelpful weight with no strength anywhere to assist you. It is a different, stiller kind of heaviness, cold radiating up through your own fingers the longer you work, so that by the second hour your hands have gone half numb in a way that has nothing to do with the room's temperature and everything to do with what you're touching, and you find yourself more than once having to stop and flex your own fingers, working blood back into them, before you can trust them again with the fine, careful movements your master's instructions require. You do not look at her face for as long as you can manage not to. This is not squeamishness, or not only squeamishness. It's something closer to the feeling you get walking past the door of a room where somebody important is speaking. The instinct that you are intruding on something not meant for your eyes at all, and the fact that your eyes are being required to be there anyway, by order, by necessity, by the simple accident of being the surgeon's apprentice with the steadiest hands available on the worst day of anyone's life in this building, does not make the intrusion feel any less like an intrusion. But you cannot avoid it forever, not doing this work, and eventually, handing your master a length of linen, your eyes go where they have been avoiding, and you see her properly for the first time. She was 44 years old. You will learn that fact later, turned into a number in a chronicle somewhere. But right now, in this room, she does not look like a number. She looks like a woman. Small, smaller than you expected somehow, with cropped grey hair beneath where a wig had been, because, and this is a detail nobody warned you about, a detail that makes Elizabeth Curl turn sharply away toward the window when your master reveals it while cleaning around the terrible wound at the neck. She'd gone entirely grey, and cut her hair short in captivity, and had worn a long auburn wig over it every day for years, a wig that had come away in the executioner's hand at the very end, in front of 200 witnesses, so that the last thing the crowd in that hall saw was not a queen's flowing hair, but the close-cropped grey head of a woman who had been made to look young for a public that expected her to look young, right up until the one moment when the disguise mattered least and fell away hardest. Your master's hands do not pause at this discovery. He simply adjusts, the way he adjusts to anything unexpected in his work, murmuring instructions to you in the same low, even tone. The wax here, Robin, along this line. Warm enough to take the shape, but not so warm it runs. You work. Your fingers, chapped and raw from a week of grinding spice in a cold shed, learn a new kind of care tonight. Learn to press wax into places you would rather not think about too directly. Learn the particular resistance of cold flesh under linen, a resistance utterly unlike anything you have handled before, heavier somehow than a living body's weight has any right to be, as though whatever had animated all that weight had also been what made it feel light. Underneath her outer gown, black from throat to hem, plain, almost severe, there is a petticoat the colour of dried blood, a deep, deliberate crimson, and when Jane Kennedy sees you notice it, she speaks for the second time, quiet, fierce, the first real heat you've heard in her voice all night. She chose that colour herself, she says, weeks ago. Chose it and had it made and told no one why until this morning when she dressed. Crimson is the colour of a martyr in the old church, boy. She knew exactly what they would see once the black gown came off once. Her voice catches, steadies, goes on. She wanted them to see it. Whatever else this kingdom does to her memory, she wanted 200 witnesses standing in that hall to see a queen dressed for martyrdom underneath the morning black, whether they understood what they were looking at or not. You have never in your life felt smaller than you feel in that moment, holding a strip of warmed wax between two fingers, looking at a scrap of crimson cloth that a condemned woman chose on purpose, weeks in advance, as her final and only remaining statement to a world that had taken every other means of speech away from her. The dog comes out from under the ruin of her skirts sometime near midnight, while your master is finishing the careful, silent work of rapping, and you have never in your life heard a sound like the sound Elizabeth Curl makes when she sees it. A small creature, some kind of terrier, matted and shaking, drenched through with blood that is not its own, refusing at first to leave the body at all, pressing itself against her side with a low continuous whine until Jane Kennedy kneels on the cold stone floor in her good gown, heedless of the ruin it's about to become, and gathers the small trembling animal into her arms, murmuring to it the way you'd murmur to a frightened child. "Gedden," she says into its wet fur, "Gedden, come away now, come away, little one. There's nothing more you can do for her here." Nobody, it turns out, had known the dog was there. Nobody had known the Queen had smuggled her small companion into the hall itself, hidden beneath her skirts through hours of trial reading and prayer, and the long walk to the block, so that in her last minutes on earth she had not, in fact, been entirely alone among strangers and enemies, the way the official record of that morning would always claim. It is such a small fact in the scale of everything else happening in this room tonight, and it is somehow the fact that undoes you, standing there with warmed wax cooling between your fingers, watching a grown woman weep into the fur of a shaking dog on a stone floor at midnight. Your master lets you both have your moment. Then gently, he says the words you understand are the whole reason for tonight's terrible, careful, exacting work. "We must finish," he says, "before the cold leaves her entirely and the work becomes harder for it. I am sorry. There is no good time for this, only the time we have." The wrapping takes hours, wax at the wound, worked smooth, then linen bound tight and even, layer over layer, spice packed into the folds the way your master learned it from an old book he keeps under lock in his shop, myrrh and storax and a little aloes ground fine, because these are the things that fight the slow corruption of flesh in a world with no better answer to offer against it. You work in near silence, the four of you, while outside the small high window the night deepens, and somewhere below in the castle the ordinary business of extinguishing candles and locking doors continues as though this were an ordinary night, as though the building itself has not just watched something happen inside it that will be written about in Rome and Paris and Madrid within the fortnight. It is nearly dawn when your master finally straightens, presses both hands into the small of his back, and says the word that ends the night's work. "Done," he says, "as much as can be done, until the coffin's ready and she can be moved to it properly. Robin, the tools." You gather the tools. Your hands are trembling now, in a way they were not trembling 3 hours ago. The strange steadiness that carried you through the work itself finally giving way now that the work is finished, and you have to set the little knife down twice before you manage to fold it back into its case without dropping it. It is on your second attempt, kneeling by the low table where the tool chest sits, that you see it. A small object, half hidden in the folds of billiard cloth that were cut away and set aside hours ago, dropped there in the chaos, and apparently overlooked by everyone in the room whose attention was fixed on graver things. A single bead, dark polished wood, threaded once through a small gap in the fabric, clearly torn loose from something larger. You know immediately what it must be. You've seen enough of the searches conducted in this castle over the past year, the confiscation of Catholic books and rosaries, and anything smelling of the old religion from every corner of the Queen's rooms, to know exactly what will happen to this bead, and to anything like it, once the men from London start their proper accounting of her belongings tomorrow. It will be burned. Everything in that hall tonight, the black cloth, the scaffold board soaked through, the straw, her outer gown, the ruin of the crimson petticoat, every last thing that touched her blood or her body or her faith. Every bit of it is going to be gathered up and put to the torch specifically so that no fragment of it can ever be venerated as a relic by anyone who might still call her a martyr rather than a traitor. You have heard Davy the groom saying so in the yard 3 days ago, half frightened and half thrilled by his own knowledge of it, the way servants get about important secrets they've overheard. Your fingers close around the bead before your mind has properly finished deciding to do it. You will spend a great deal of the rest of your life turning that decision over, examining it from every angle, trying to work out exactly what you thought you were doing, kneeling on her cold stone floor at 4 a.m. with a dead Queen's rosary bead pressed into your palm and your master's back turned 3 feet away. You are not, you will eventually decide, trying to make any particular statement about religion, or about the rights and wrongs of what had happened in that hall tonight, because you were 15 years old and entirely unequipped to have an opinion on matters that had occupied the finest legal and theological minds of 2 kingdoms for the better part of 2 decades. You were doing something much smaller and much harder to explain. You were refusing, in the only tiny, private, entirely unheroic way available to you, to let every single trace of a woman's existence be reduced to smoke and ash before the sun came up. Somebody, you remember thinking, with a particular fierce clarity that comes to you sometimes at 4 a.m. after a night with no sleep in it, somebody should keep one small true thing of hers that doesn't end up burned on Sir Amyas Pauli's bonfire. You slip the bead into the seam of your own coat, the little gap where a stitch has already worked loose near the hem, and you do it with hands that have somehow, despite everything, gone perfectly steady again. Your master straightens, turns, sees you crouched by the tool chest. "Robin, are you finished there?" "Yes, master." Your voice comes out almost normal. "Just the last of the tools." He looks at you a moment longer than the question requires, and you brace yourself for the question you're certain is coming, the one that will end this whole enterprise before it's even begun. But he only nods, tired past the point of noticing anything beyond his own exhaustion, and turns to help the 2 ladies with the last small tasks of a night that has asked more of every person in this room than any night reasonably should. You carry the tool chest out through the corridor, past the guards who barely glance at you now, Boys with tool chests apparently having stopped registering as a threat sometime around 3 in the morning, and out into a yard where the sky has gone the particular grey blue of an hour before proper dawn. The cold outside feels almost gentle after the cold of that room. You stand for a moment, breathing it in, feeling the small hard shape of the bead through the fabric of your coat like a stone in your shoe, except that it's over your heart instead of under your foot, and it feels, in that strange grey hour, less like a weight than like something holding you together. Master Ashby comes out a few minutes behind you, the two of you walking back down toward the village in a silence neither of you seems able to break. It's Davy the groom, jogging to catch up with a lantern swinging wildly in his hand, who finally says the thing that neither of you has managed to. They're saying, he pants, falling into step, that when the executioner lifted her head up for the crowd to see, by the hair like they always do, his hand came away with the wig still in it, and the head dropped, and everyone in that hall went dead silent for the space of maybe 10 breaths, because for a moment nobody could work out what they were even looking at. A queen with grey hair cropped short as a nun's. They say her lips kept moving after, some say a full quarter hour, praying they reckon, though God knows how a man's meant to tell prayer from anything else once the... He stops himself. Even Davy apparently has limits. They're saying all sorts is what I mean. The whole village will be saying all sorts by noon. The whole village, your master says, in a voice with no patience left in it at all, would do well to say very little, about very much, for quite some time. Go home, Davy. Sleep, if you can manage it. You walk the rest of the way in silence. When you reach the shop, your master unlocks the door with hands that are shaking now. Finally, the way yours shook an hour ago. The two of you having apparently traded your exhaustion back and forth all night like a coin. Nobody wants to be the one holding when the music stops. He sets the chest down just inside the door and looks at you for a long moment in the grey half-light coming through the shop window. You did good work tonight, Robin, he says, steadier than I had any right to expect. I want you to know that, whatever else you remember about this night years from now, you did good work and you did it with the respect the work deserved. You think about the bead pressed against your ribs and say nothing about it, and feel, for the first time in your short apprenticeship, the particular loneliness of having done something your master would very likely forbid if he knew, and knowing you would do it again anyway. Thank you, master, is all you say. Go and sleep. There'll be more work tomorrow. The coffin needs lining, and I doubt either of us has seen the last of that castle for some while yet. He is, as it turns out, entirely correct, though neither of you has the faintest idea yet just how long some while is actually going to mean. The lie sits with you longer than the searcher's visit itself does. You find, over the following weeks, that it settles into your chest in a way the terror of the search did not. A low persistent ache rather than a sharp one. The particular discomfort of having told an untruth to the one person whose good opinion you value above nearly everyone else's, and having gotten away with it clean. Your master never raises the matter again, not once, and his manner toward you in the weeks that follow shows no sign whatsoever of suspicion or distance, which somehow makes the whole thing worse rather than better. You catch yourself more than once on the edge of confessing, the words halfway formed in your mouth some quiet evening by the shop fire, and each time you swallow them back down, telling yourself it would serve no purpose now beyond upsetting a man who has already carried more than his fair share of this whole grim business, and telling yourself, too, in the small, honest corner of your mind you can never quite silence, that you're not entirely certain you would make a different choice. even given the chance to choose again. It is your master himself in the end, quite without meaning to, who gives you something like absolution, though he never learns he's given it. Late one evening in March, mixing a plaster by candlelight for a farmer's bad knee, he tells you, apropos of nothing you'd asked him, about an old teacher of his own, a physician in London under whom he'd trained briefly as a very young man, who once told him that every person in a healing trade eventually accumulates a handful of private decisions they make in a single instant. Decisions nobody trained them for and no textbook covers, and that the measure of a good practitioner is not that he never makes such decisions, but that he makes them for reasons he could stand behind if ever called to account, rather than for reasons of simple carelessness or cruelty. There'll come moments in your own work, Robin, mark me, when you'll have to decide something in the space of a single breath, with nobody there to tell you the proper rule for it, because there isn't one. All I can teach you is to make sure that whatever you decide in that single breath, you could say it out loud afterward to your own conscience and not flinch from the sound of it. You think about the bead still resting in the seam of your coat, and you find, turning your master's words over in your mind long after the plaster has cooled and the farmer's knee has been seen to, that you can in fact say the reason for what you did out loud to your own conscience, without flinching from it. You wanted to save one small, true thing of hers from a fire built to erase her entirely. It is not a grand reason, and it would satisfy no court in the land, and it required you to lie to a man who deserved better from you. But it is, you decide, a reason you can live with, and having decided that, you find gradually over the following weeks that the low persistent ache in your chest begins, very slowly, to ease. The days that follow settle into a strange, muffled rhythm that you will later understand was the whole kingdom trying to work out how to feel about something it had wanted and dreaded in equal measure for the better part of 20 years. Word travels outward from Fotheringhay in every direction, by rider and by rumour, both travelling roughly the same speed, so that by the second day even the tavern boys down in the village are arguing about details that nobody outside that locked room could possibly have known for certain, embroidering the story with fresh horrors and fresh miracles every time it changes hands. You hear a dozen versions of what happened to the dog. You hear that the executioner, a man named Bull who's performed this grim office before and clearly still made a botch of it, needed 2 full strokes of the axe before the work was properly finished, and a third stroke of something smaller to complete what the axe had failed to do cleanly. A detail that turns your stomach every time somebody repeats it in the market, mostly because you now know, having stood in that room afterward, exactly how much of the evidence of that struggle your own hands helped to rap away out of sight. The village itself, in the days immediately following, feels less like a place recovering from a shock than a place holding its breath, waiting to learn what shape the shock is going to eventually take once the rest of the world has finished reacting to it. Riders pass through constantly now, far more than the ordinary traffic of a market town on the road between London and the north, and every one of them, it seems, carries some fragment of news that reaches your master's shop within the hour, second-hand, third-hand, worn smooth and strange by each retelling the way a stone gets worn smooth by a river. You hear that bonfires were lit in London the moment word arrived, bells rung in celebration in half the parish churches of the capital, as though a battle had been won rather than a captive woman quietly killed in a locked hall. You hear, in the same breath, from a different traveller with a different accent, that in Paris the French court has gone into a kind of controlled fury, that ambassadors have been recalled, that in Rome the Pope himself is said to have wept on hearing the news and ordered prayers said for a woman his own church had spent decades quietly, cautiously, never quite fully committing to calling a martyr for fear of the diplomatic complications that word would bring down on every Catholic head in England, still trying to practice their faith in secret. You find all of this faintly bewildering, standing behind your master's counter, grinding simples for coughs and toothache, while the whole of Europe apparently rearranges its opinion of England around an event you personally helped clean up afterward with your own two hands. It occurs to you more than once in those first strange days that there is something almost obscene about the gap between the enormous echoing significance the wider world is already assigning to what happened in that hall, and the small, exhausted, entirely unglamorous reality of the work itself. Wax and linen and spice, a trembling dog, a woman's tears into her own gathered skirts on a cold stone floor. The world, it seems, wants this death to mean something vast and abstract. You were there for the part of it that was simply, terribly physical. There is a Sunday, perhaps 10 days after the execution, when your master sends you up to check on a garrison soldier's infected finger, and you find yourself, the errand finished sooner than expected, with an unaccustomed hour of free time and no particular reason to hurry back down the hill. You climb, on impulse, the worn spiral stair inside the village church tower, a stair you have climbed perhaps twice before in your whole apprenticeship, mostly out of boyish curiosity about the bell mechanism, and you come out onto the narrow parapet at the top into a wind sharp enough to make your eyes water, and a view that stops you where you stand. The whole of the flat fen country spreads out below you in every direction, brown and green and silver where standing water catches the pale February light, hedgerows drawing their thin dark lines across the fields like the strokes of some enormous careless pen. And there, perhaps half a mile distant, sitting low and grey on its modest rise above the river, is the castle. From this height, from this distance, it looks smaller than it has any right to look, smaller than the terrible weight of what happened inside it seems to demand. A scatter of towers and walls, smoke rising thin and ordinary from a handful of chimneys, no different from up here than any other fortified manor house scattered across the width of England, hundreds of them, most containing nothing more dramatic than the ordinary business of eating and sleeping and quarrelling over inheritance. You stand there a long while, the wind pulling at your hair, thinking about the strange disproportion of it. A building can look from a sufficient distance entirely unremarkable, and still contain, within its ordinary stone walls, the precise spot where the balance of two kingdoms' fortunes quietly, permanently shifted. You think about the Queen of Scots herself, who spent the last 5 months of her life confined within those walls you can see from here, looking out, presumably, at this exact same flat, unremarkable countryside day after day, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon her cousin in London was deciding her fate, and knowing too that from this same modest elevation, this same castle would have looked, to her, like the entire visible world, the whole of her remaining existence narrowed down to one low grey pile of stone, on a rise above a river she was never again permitted to cross. You think, too, in the particular way a boy of 15 thinks about things too large for him, about how strange it is that kingdoms and crowns and warrants signed in far-off London can feel, from up here, so completely disconnected from the actual weight of a body on a low wooden table, the actual smell of wet iron in candlelit air, the actual small hard shape of a rosary bead pressed into the seam of a coat. The world of kings, you decide, standing on that windswept parapet with your apprentice's satchel still slung across your shoulder, is built almost entirely out of documents and declarations and grand abstract words like treason and succession and the safety of the realm. The world you actually live in, down at ground level, is built out of hands doing careful work in cold rooms, and it is this second world, you think, that ends up quietly carrying the true weight of everything the first world decides, while rarely getting any credit for having carried it at all. You climb back down the tower stair with your legs a little unsteady, whether from the height or from the thoughts you've just been thinking you couldn't rightly say, and you walk back down the hill toward the village with the wind at your back the whole way, thinking that you have understood something today that you didn't understand yesterday, though you would struggle, even now, to put it into words your master would find entirely sensible. The danger, when it comes, arrives from a direction you had not properly considered at all. It is toward the end of February, perhaps 3 weeks after the execution, when word runs through the village that Sir Amyas Paulet's men are conducting searches, not just within the castle itself, but in certain households of the surrounding village and countryside on the theory, reasonable enough, given the strength of feeling the spice merchant in Peterborough had already warned you about, that sympathisers might be attempting to gather up and conceal fragments of the Queen's belongings or of the execution itself as devotional objects. Splinters of the scaffold, threads from the black gown, anything at all that a household with old religion sympathies might treasure in secret as a relic of a woman. Certain quarters of the kingdom are already, quietly, beginning to whisper about as a martyr. You learn of this from Davy the groom, breathless, having run the whole way down from the castle specifically to warn your master because, and this detail makes your stomach drop somewhere around your boots, your master's own household is not exempt from suspicion, given how closely and how intimately his work brought him into contact with exactly the sort of objects the searchers are hunting for. They'll likely come here within the day, Davy pants, standing in the shop doorway with his chest heaving. Sir Amyas has ordered every house that had dealings with the body search proper, says it's for the Crown's own protection, keeping down talk of martyrdom before it takes proper root. I thought you'd want the warning is all, given how the two of you were up there that whole first night. Your master's face goes carefully, deliberately blank in the particular way you've come to recognise as the expression he wears when he is thinking very fast and does not want anyone in the room to see quite how fast. We've nothing here that shouldn't be here, he says evenly to Davy, and then, once the groom has gone, to you in a much quieter voice, standing very close. Robin, is there anything at all, that you took from that room that night or after? I will not be angry. I give you my word on that, whatever the answer is. But I need to know now, before any searcher's hand finds it for us. You stand there, in your master's shop, with the small hard weight of the bead pressed against your ribs through the seam of your coat, and you feel the particular vertigo of a decision arriving far sooner and far more sharply than you'd ever properly prepared for it. 3 weeks of quiet private secret-keeping suddenly narrowed down to this one moment, this one question, asked by the one person in the world whose trust you most dread losing. You could tell him. Some small cowardly part of you wants very badly to tell him, to hand the whole terrible responsibility over to an adult who might know better than you what ought to be done with it. But you find, when you actually open your mouth to answer, that a different instinct wins out, quieter and more stubborn than you expected of yourself. No, master, you say. Nothing. He looks at you for a long moment, and you cannot tell afterward whether he believed you entirely or half believed you, and chose, for reasons of his own, not to press further, or saw straight through the lie, and decided that whatever burden you were carrying was, in the end, yours alone to carry, the way his own careful silence about the rightness of the execution had always been his alone to carry. What he actually says after that long look is simply this: "Then we've nothing to fear from any search, and no cause to act as though we do. Straighten your face, Robin. A guilty look invites exactly the kind of attention an innocent household ought never to attract. The searchers do come that same afternoon, 3 grim men in Mr&Mrs. livery who go through your master's shop and the small rooms above it, with a thoroughness that leaves your heart hammering the entire time, turning out chests, unfolding linens, even, at one point, running careful fingers along the seams of a spare coat hanging on a peg by the door, though not mercifully the coat you happen to be wearing at that exact moment, tucked half behind the counter with your arms crossed, in what you hope passes for the posture of a bored apprentice rather than a terrified one. They find nothing, because there is, in truth, nothing in that shop for them to find beyond the ordinary tools and simples of a barber-surgeon's ordinary trade, and they leave within the half-hour with the particular brusque, unapologetic manner of men who have searched 100 houses that morning and expect to search 100 more before the week is out. Your master closes the door behind them, sets the bar across it, and stands with his back against it for a long moment, breathing. "That's an experience," he says, finally, with a shakiness in his voice that you rarely hear from him, "that I hope never to repeat, for as long as I live." You say nothing. Your legs feel unsteady in a way that has nothing to do with any church tower, and it takes you the better part of the evening to convince your own racing heart that the danger has genuinely passed, at least for today, at least for this particular search. But you understand from that afternoon onward, with a clarity that will only sharpen over the coming months, that the small object you chose to save has a cost attached to it that goes well beyond your own private conscience, a cost that could, if you are careless even once, land not just on you but on the master who trained you and trusted you and asked you plainly to tell him the truth, and to whom you lied for the first and, you promise yourself, standing there with your heart still hammering, the last time in your whole apprenticeship. You go back to the castle 3 more times over the following week, always at strange hours, always summoned by a curt note carried down by one of the London men, and each time the work is smaller and more administrative than the terrible intensity of that first night, but no less strange for it. Your master is asked to examine and confirm the sealing of the lead coffin once it arrives from Peterborough, a heavy, ugly thing that takes 4 men to carry, and that seems, to your eye, entirely disproportionate in size and weight to the small woman you helped prepare inside it. He's asked to advise on how long the body might reasonably be expected to keep, given the embalming already performed, in the event that burial is delayed by weeks, or, and here the London official asking the question drops his voice, glancing around the room as though the walls themselves might report him for even raising the possibility, by months. It is on your 3rd visit in the first week of March, not long after the fright of the search of your own master's shop had finally begun to fade, that you finally see the room itself. Her actual chamber, not the smaller privy room where the work of that first terrible night was done, but the larger apartment where she lived, read, sewed, wrote her endless letters, and prayed for the better part of 5 months as a prisoner in this castle. You're sent there with your master and two of the London commissioners, ostensibly to help catalogue certain items of a physical nature, bedding, hangings, anything that might have absorbed the smell of illness or corruption during her final weeks and would need burning or thorough airing before the room could be given back to ordinary use. But you understand within about 30 seconds of walking through the door that this is not really what's happening in this room at all. This is a search. A thorough, systematic, room-by-room dismantling of everything the Queen of Scots owned or touched or wrote in the last 5 months of her life, conducted by grim men with lists in their hands and a particular hard focus in their eyes that tells you they're looking for something specific, or perhaps looking for anything at all that might justify, retroactively, in the court of European opinion, the thing that has already been done and cannot now be undone. The room itself, even stripped and searched, still carries traces of the life lived in it. There's a small writing desk near the window, its surface scarred with ink stains going back years, a scattering of quills in a chipped clay pot, sealing wax in 3 colours melted down to stubs. There are books, dozens of them, in French and Latin and Scots, stacked and restacked by searching hands that clearly have no particular reverence for the objects themselves, only for whatever might be hidden inside their bindings or between their pages. You watch one of the commissioners flip through a small psalter, shake it hard by the spine as though expecting something to fall out, find nothing, and toss it onto a growing pile of items marked for burning with exactly the same care he might show a pile of kindling. Your master is asked at one point to examine a small ivory casket found in a locked drawer of the writing desk, on the theory that it might contain some manner of poison or medicine that could shed light on the state of the Queen's health in her final weeks, evidence perhaps to be used in whatever propaganda pamphlet will inevitably follow this whole grim business into print within the month. He opens it carefully, professionally, and finds inside not poisons, but a small collection of entirely ordinary things, a lock of pale hair, almost certainly a child's, that the commissioners speculate might have belonged to her son James, whom she's not seen since he was an infant and will now never see at all. A folded and much refolded letter in French, the ink faded soft at every crease from repeated handling. A small enamelled Agnus Dei medallion, the kind of Catholic devotional object that has been specifically repeatedly forbidden in every search this castle has ever conducted of her rooms, and that she has apparently somehow managed to keep hidden from every previous search for months. This goes on the list, the senior commissioner says, turning the medallion over in his fingers with obvious distaste, as though it might be warm to the touch, as though whatever power he imagines it carries might transfer itself into his own hand through simple contact. All of it, the letter especially, whoever it's addressed to may yet prove significant. The search continues through the afternoon with a thoroughness that begins to feel, after the first hour, almost mechanical, the commissioners moving from object to object with a flat efficiency of men who have long since stopped seeing what they're handling as belonging to a particular dead woman, and started seeing it only as evidence or threat or fuel for a bonfire. You're put to work stripping the bed hangings, heavy embroidered cloth grown stiff and cold in an unheated room, your fingers working the ties loose one by one while dust rises in the slanted afternoon light and catches in your throat. Underneath the mattress, tucked into a slit in the ticking that has clearly been opened and resewn more than once, a commissioner finds a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and you watch him read through them, standing at the window, his face giving away nothing, before he adds the whole bundle, ribbon and all, to the growing pile without comment. There is a work basket, overturned and searched, spilling threads of every colour across the stripped bed, half-finished embroidery still pinned to its frame, a religious scene worked in silk, a pelican tearing at its own breast to feed its young, a design your master tells you afterward is an old emblem of self-sacrifice that has clearly, deliberately, been chosen and worked by hands that understood exactly what they were stitching and why. Nobody in the room remarks on it directly, but you notice the youngest of the three commissioners look at it a moment too long before setting it, gently, almost carefully, onto the pile with everything else, and you wonder, watching him do it, whether even a man sent specifically to erase every trace of Catholic sympathy from this room can entirely help noticing the particular skill and patience worked into a piece of embroidery, regardless of what he's been ordered to think about the woman who made it. There are smaller things too, the kind of ordinary domestic clutter that accumulates around any person confined to a small set of rooms for 5 months, with nothing much to do but wait. A chessboard with half its pieces missing, worn smooth at the edges from handling. A set of small brass scales, the kind used for weighing coin or medicine, that nobody can quite explain the purpose of, and that gets added to the pile anyway, on the general principle that anything unexplained is safer burned than left unaccounted for. A child's small wooden top badly chipped, that makes even the senior commissioner pause for a moment before he tosses it, almost gently, onto the same growing heap, perhaps recognizing, as you recognize, that a woman who kept a child's toy among her own belongings for 5 months of solitary confinement was very likely keeping it for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with treason. By the time the light starts failing, the room stands nearly bare, its walls showing pale rectangles where tapestries hung, the floor swept clear of everything but the heaviest furniture, and the pile marked "to be burned" has grown to a size that takes 4 men and 2 trips to carry down to the waiting fire in the yard below. You watch this small ivory casket, containing the only physical trace remaining of a mother's love for a son she will now never see reconciled with her, get added to a pile destined for the same fire that will eventually consume the scaffold boards and the crimson petticoat and every other object this room, this castle, this whole grim episode has produced. It occurs to you, standing there holding a basin your master doesn't currently need, that the bead pressed into the seam of your coat has become, without your fully intending it, a very small act of quiet defiance against exactly this process. Somewhere in this room, right now, men with lists are trying to erase a woman as completely as the law and the fire can manage, and you, 15 years old, entirely powerless to stop any part of it, are nonetheless walking around with one tiny fragment of her that they will never find, never catalogue, never burn. It should feel like triumph. Mostly it just feels like a very heavy secret to carry through a room full of men whose entire purpose today is finding exactly this kind of secret and destroying it. The commissioners finished their work in that room by late afternoon, having filled 2 full chests with items marked for the London warehouses, and a third smaller pile marked simply "to be burned," that includes, you notice with a small twist of feeling you don't entirely have a name for, the crimson-stained scaffold cloth that was hastily removed from the Great Hall on the night itself, and that has apparently been sitting folded in a locked storeroom ever since, awaiting exactly this decision. "Best it's done quickly," the senior commissioner says to nobody in particular, watching 2 servants carry the marked pile out toward the yard where a fire has already been laid, and is waiting, unlit, for its purpose. There's already talk in the north of pilgrims wanting to visit this place. Relics of a supposed martyr, God help us. Better there's nothing left for them to venerate by the time word properly spreads. Your master says nothing to this. He has learned, over these strange weeks, the same lesson every servant in this castle has learned about matters of state and religion, that the wisest response to hearing men discuss such things aloud is a carefully composed silence that commits you to no opinion whatsoever. But you notice, walking back down toward the village that evening with the winter light already failing around 4 in the afternoon, that he takes the long way, the path that goes past the yard rather than around it, and that he slows his pace just slightly as you both pass close enough to smell smoke and see the orange glow of a fire that has by now clearly been burning for some hours. Neither of you says anything about it, but you notice him glance toward it, once, briefly, with an expression you can't entirely read, and you wonder, not for the first time, whether your master might understand rather more about the impulse that put a rosary bead into the seam of your coat than either of you would ever have occasion to discuss out loud. Winter deepens into the kind of cold that makes the whole village move slower, that cracks the skin across your knuckles no matter how much of your master's own goose-grease salve you work into them each night, that turns every errand into a small ordeal of numb fingers and streaming eyes, and the particular ache that comes from walking against a wind sharp enough to feel like it's trying to take a layer of you along with it. The castle, up on its slow rise above the flat surrounding fields, seems to sit differently in the landscape now than it did before the 8th of February, though you couldn't properly explain to anyone what's actually changed about a pile of stone that hasn't moved an inch. Perhaps it's only that everyone in the village now looks at it and thinks the same private, unspoken thought, whatever their politics. That's the place where it happened. That's where a queen died, and where, as everyone gradually comes to understand over the following weeks, her body is still lying, sealed in its heavy lead coffin in a locked chapel within the castle walls, unburied, because nobody with the actual authority to order a burial has yet been willing to give that order. This is the detail that eventually becomes the strangest and, in its own quiet way, the cruelest part of the entire episode, at least from where you're standing in the middle of it. The execution itself was swift, terrible, and final in the way executions are meant to be. What follows it is not final at all. It is a limbo that stretches on and on through the rest of February, through March, through a slow, wet English spring that turns the fields around the castle first to mud, and then gradually to green, while a dead woman's body sits sealed in lead in a locked room, because the Queen who signed the warrant for her death apparently cannot bring herself to also sign the far less consequential order permitting a Christian burial. You hear, in the way you hear everything now, filtered through Davy the groom and the castle kitchen, gossip that reaches your master's shop by way of servants coming in for salves and simples, that Elizabeth herself has reportedly been thrown into a genuine fury by the execution being carried out at all, that she claims, whether sincerely or for the benefit of foreign ambassadors watching her reaction with close interest, nobody in the village can agree, that she never truly intended the warrant to be acted upon, that her secretary exceeded his instructions, that heads other than the Scottish Queen's ought properly to roll over this business. You hear that the secretary in question, a man named Davison, has been sent to the Tower for his trouble, made to answer for a decision that everyone in the castle privately understands was exactly what the Queen wanted done, and exactly what she cannot now afford to be seen to have wanted. None of which changes the fact that a body remains unburied in a locked chapel through the whole slow turning of an English spring, while the woman with the power to end that limbo occupies herself instead with matters of appearance and denial 400 miles away in London. The coffin itself, once your master's initial work is finished and the lead casing properly soldered shut against the air, is moved to a small private chapel within the castle walls, a bare, cold, seldom used room that nobody in the household seems entirely comfortable discussing above a murmur, and your master is called back twice during March to confirm, at Sir Amyas's own anxious request, that the seal is holding and that no smell of corruption has begun to seep through into the corridor outside. You go with him both times, and both times the actual examination takes only minutes, a careful inspection of the soldered joints, a cautious sniff at the air close to the lead, a murmured confirmation that all remains as it should, but the walk to and from that little chapel stretches itself out in your memory, far longer than the few minutes it actually takes, your footsteps echoing off cold stone in a corridor lit by a single guttering lamp, the guard at the door watching you both with the flat, wary attention of a man who's been given no explanation for why a coffin needs guarding quite this closely, and has decided sensibly not to ask. There is something particular about knowing exactly what lies sealed inside a plain lead box in a locked, unheated room, something that changes the whole character of a building for you in a way you find hard to properly name. You have walked past that chapel door a dozen times since, on other errands, and every single time, without exception, some part of your attention catches on it, the way your tongue catches on a broken tooth, checking almost against your will that the thing you know is there is in fact still there, still sealed, still waiting for a decision that keeps failing to arrive from London. You go back to the castle twice more in April, both times on your master's business rather than anything to do with the coffin itself, tending to an ordinary run of coughs and chilblains among the garrison, and both times you find some excuse, however small, to walk past the chapel wing, though the door is kept locked and guarded, and there is in truth nothing whatsoever to see. It is not, you eventually admit to yourself, that you expect to see anything. It's that you find yourself unable to entirely let go of the strange responsibility you took on that first terrible night, the sense that having once held a piece of her secret, and hers alone in your own two hands, some thread now connects you to whatever happens to the rest of her, for as long as that rest of her remains unresolved. It is on the second of these April visits that you have the conversation with Jane Kennedy that you will remember, in certain ways, more clearly than you remember the night of the execution itself. You encounter her by accident in the small walled garden behind the castle's private chapel, a garden gone half to weed and half to the first green shoots of April, where she is apparently taken to walking most afternoons, alone except for the small terrier that trots at her heel with a devotion that has clearly transferred itself entirely onto her since the night it lost its true mistress. She recognizes you, the surgeon's apprentice, the boy with steady hands, and you find yourself absurdly gratified that she remembers you at all, given everything else she has had to carry in her mind these past months. And she gestures, almost without thinking, for you to walk with her a moment along the gravel path, the dog padding ahead of you both. "You've been sent up again," she says. "It isn't quite a question." "For the garrison, my lady. Nothing to do with..." You gesture vaguely toward the chapel wing, unsure how to finish the sentence politely. With her. Jane Kennedy says the word plainly, without flinching from it the way you had been about to. You may say it, boy. I have found these last months that the people who refuse to say her name or speak of what happened to her are very often the same people most eager to see her forgotten entirely. And I have grown to prefer plain speech to that particular kindness. You walk in silence for a few paces, the gravel crunching under your boots, the dog snuffling at something in the dead leaves along the border of the path. Do you know, she says after a while, in a voice pitched for herself as much as for you, that she is still lying up there, in that cold little chapel, exactly as your master left her that night, because a queen 400 miles from here cannot decide between the political costs of a proper Catholic funeral, which her own church forbids, and the political costs of a Protestant one, which would offend half of Europe and every soul still loyal to the old faith in Scotland and beyond. So she does neither. She simply lets the body wait. Jane Kennedy shakes her head, a small, tired motion, the motion of someone who has argued this point out fully in her own mind many times already, and arrived nowhere useful. There is a particular kind of cruelty, boy, in indecision practiced by the powerful upon the powerless, even after the powerless are already dead. The living at least can be made to suffer only so long as they draw breath. The dead, it turns out, can be made to wait on someone else's convenience indefinitely. Do you think she'll be buried properly, eventually? Eventually. Jane Kennedy repeats the word as though testing its weight. Everyone tells me eventually. I have learned to distrust that word rather thoroughly this past year. She stops walking, turns to look at you directly for the first time in the conversation. You handled her with respect that night. I saw that, even through everything else I was seeing. Your master too, but you especially, being so young and asked to do so much. I have not had many opportunities in the week since to thank anyone in this dreadful place for anything at all. Let me thank you now, since the chance has come. Whatever this kingdom eventually decides to do with her memory, know that there were at least a few hands in that room that touched her gently, at the very end, when gentleness was in desperately short supply. You don't know what to say to this. You settle, in the end, on the truth, or at least the small piece of it you're able to give voice to. I've thought about that night every day since, my lady. I don't think I'll ever entirely stop thinking about it. No, she says, with something that might almost be the ghost of a smile. I don't imagine you will. Grief has a way of settling into the people who witness it, boy, even when it isn't properly theirs to carry. You'll find, as you get older, that you go on carrying pieces of things you saw once, briefly, at 15, long after the people who lived through the whole of it have gone to their own graves. That is simply what it means to have been present at something. There is no discount for youth in memory's accounting, only in how long you have left to carry it. Elizabeth Curl finds you a little further along the same path, sitting on a low stone bench near the garden's far wall with some mending in her lap that she doesn't appear to be making much progress on, and she watches you and Jane Kennedy part ways for a moment before beckoning you over with a small tilt of her head, as though she too has been waiting for some occasion to say a thing she's been carrying. You were the one who found the dog's collar, she says, without preamble once you're close enough, under the folds of the billiard cloth that first night. I saw you set it aside so carefully, rather than simply tossing it onto whatever pile the London men were building. I never thanked you for that either. You hadn't thought of it as anything at the time, a small worn leather collar with a tarnished buckle, set gently to one side while your master worked, but you find, hearing her name it now, that you remember the exact weight and texture of it in your fingers with a clarity that surprises you. It seemed a small enough thing to spare, my lady, compared to everything else. Small things are very often the only things left for any of us to spare, once the large ones have all been decided by people who never once asked our opinion of the matter. She sets her mending down in her lap, looks past you toward the grey bulk of the chapel wing. Jane will tell you grief settles into a person and stays there. I've come to believe something slightly different myself these past months. Watching that dog sleep every night now at the foot of her own bed rather than her mistress's, I believe grief moves if you let it. The way that little creature moved from one loyalty to another once the first one was no longer there to receive it. It doesn't vanish, but it finds somewhere new to rest, in time, if you're patient with it, and if you're lucky enough to have somewhere left to put it. She picks her mending back up, and you leave her to it, walking on to catch up with Jane Kennedy near the garden gate, and the conversation, such as it was, ends there. But you turn both women's words over for months afterward, and you come to understand gradually that she has given you, without quite meaning to, the single truest piece of wisdom anyone offers you in this whole strange chapter of your apprenticeship, that bearing witness is its own kind of burden, separate from and sometimes heavier than the events themselves, and that the only honest thing to do with such a burden is to keep carrying it honestly, rather than set it down pretending it never happened, or blow it up into something grander than it was. Between the search of your master's shop and the coming of May, the ordinary business of your apprenticeship continues alongside all of this, the way ordinary business always does, stubbornly regardless of whatever enormous events happen to be unfolding half a mile up the hill. There are still teeth to be pulled on market day, still farmers coming in with bad backs from the spring ploughing, still the endless small commerce of a village apothecary shop that has nothing whatsoever to do with dead queens, and everything to do with keeping 400 living souls reasonably free of boils and ague. You find, gratefully, that this ordinary work becomes a kind of anchor through the strange months of waiting, something steady to hold on to with your hands while the larger, stranger business up at the castle continues at its own indefinite pace. It's during this stretch, sometime in April, that you have your one real conversation with the vicar of the village church, old Master Pargeter, a mild, cautious man who has held the living for close on 30 years and has, in that time, learned to survive the swing of every religious weather vane England has thrown at him without ever once, so far as anyone can tell, revealing what he actually believes about any of it. He comes into your master's shop for a dose against his own rheumatism and finds you alone, your master out on a call, and lingers a while longer than his errand strictly requires, watching you grind a mixture of willow bark and meadowsweet with the particular idle attention of an old man who has decided for reasons of his own that he'd like a bit of company. "You were up at the castle," he says eventually, not quite a question. "That night." "Yes, Master Pargeter." He nods slowly, watching your hands work the pestle. "I buried a good many souls in my time, boy, and I've noticed a thing about the ones who die sudden and violent, whatever the rights and wrongs of how they came to it. The living left behind always want the death to mean something enormous and eternal, a judgment of God, a mark of destiny, a sign. And the dying themselves, in my long experience of sitting with them at the very end, mostly just want someone to hold their hand steady and not let them go into it entirely alone. I dare say whatever happened up at that castle in February was exactly the same, underneath all the grand talk of treason and succession that's been flying about ever since. A frightened woman at the very end wanting a steady hand nearby. You gave her that by every account I've heard, whether you meant to carry any grander meaning in it or not. I don't know that I did much, sir. I only held the wax and the linen. That's very often the whole of what any of us manage to do for each other in the end, he says, easing himself up from the stool with the careful movements of a man whose joints have long since stopped forgiving sudden effort. Holding the wax and the linen for someone else's terrible moment. It doesn't sound like much said plainly. It is, in fact, nearly everything. He pays for his dose and leaves, and you think about his words for a long while afterward, turning them over alongside your master's earlier lesson about decisions made in the space of a single breath, and you begin to understand slowly that this whole strange chapter of your apprenticeship has been quietly furnishing you with a small collection of hard-won wisdom from every direction at once, offered by people who have no idea they're teaching you anything at all, simply because they happened to be standing nearby when you needed badly to hear it. May comes, and with it, finally, movement. Word reaches the village, by way of an official proclamation your master reads aloud in the shop to a small gathering of curious neighbours, that the Queen of England has at last consented to a funeral to be conducted at Peterborough Cathedral, some 12 miles distant, with what the proclamation describes, in language that manages to sound both grand and grudging at once, as such honour and ceremony as befits her former estate. The date is set for the 1st of August. 3 more months of waiting, on top of the nearly 6 already past, though at least now the waiting has a shape to it, an end visible on the horizon rather than an indefinite stretch into nothing. Your master is engaged once more in the final weeks before the funeral, this time to help oversee the transfer of the coffin from its temporary resting place in the castle chapel to a proper hearse for the journey to Peterborough, a task that involves rather less of the terrible intimate work of that first night, and rather more of the mechanical business of ropes and pulleys, and 4 straining men easing an unreasonably heavy-lead coffin down a narrow stair without cracking either the coffin or their own backs in the attempt. You are there for this on the last day of July, and you find it, oddly, less harrowing than you expected. 6 months of waiting have worn some of the raw edge off the whole business, transformed it from an open wound into something closer to a scar, still tender if pressed directly, but no longer something you flinch away from on instinct alone. It is on this final visit, helping carry a coil of rope back to the storeroom while the coffin is secured for its journey, that you find yourself, quite by accident, standing for a few minutes alone in what was once the Queen's own chamber, now stripped bare of everything but the largest furniture, awaiting whatever ordinary use the castle intends for it, once this whole strange episode has finally, formally concluded. The room feels smaller than it did in February, smaller and far less significant. Sunlight coming in clean and ordinary through windows that are no longer shuttered, dust motes turning slowly in the July heat, no trace remaining of ink stains or scattered quills, or locked drawers containing ivory caskets. It has become simply a room. Stone walls and a wooden floor and light coming through glass, the way any room in any castle eventually becomes just its own bare bones, once everything a particular life added to it has been carried away. You take the bead out of your coat seam that afternoon, for the first time since the night you put it there, turning it over between your fingers in the July light. It is smaller than you remembered, plainer, a single dark wooden bead that could have come from any rosary belonging to any devout woman in Christendom. Nothing about its physical presence hinting at the extraordinary chain of events it happened to be attached to on the single worst night of its owner's life. You think, standing there, about slipping it back into some corner of this now empty room, some small private act of return, but you find in the end that you cannot quite make yourself do it. Whatever this small object has become to you, over 6 strange months of carrying it in secret, it has stopped being simply hers and become, in some complicated way you don't fully understand, partly yours as well. A physical reminder that you are present at something enormous and terrible, that you touched history with your own 2 chapped and raw-knuckled hands, and that in the small space of your own private conscience, at least one tiny piece of a woman the state was determined to erase entirely managed, quietly, to survive. You put it back in the seam of your coat and follow the sound of your master's voice calling you back to the work at hand. The funeral itself on the 1st of August is a strange, muted, oddly overdressed affair, and you are there for nearly the whole of it, because your master, having been so intimately involved in the body's preparation, is asked at the last moment to travel with the coffin party as far as Peterborough itself, in case any question arises about the state of the remains after so many months of waiting, and he takes you with him, both of you riding behind the slow procession on the shop's aging grey mare, your satchel packed once more, this time with nothing more dramatic than a flask of vinegar water against the August heat, and a clean shirt in case the first one wilts through entirely before the day is done. You leave Fotheringhay before dawn, the coffin already loaded onto its draped hearse the night before under guard, and the procession that forms up in the grey early light is longer and grander than anything you've ever personally witnessed. Heralds in tabards riding ahead, a company of mourners on foot and on horseback stretching back along the road, further than you can properly see, black cloth and black plumes on every horse's harness, the whole slow-moving column raising a fine pale dust from the dry summer road that settles on everyone's black clothing within the first mile, and gives the entire procession, by mid-morning, the strange grey-dusted look of mourners already half turned to ash themselves. The 12 miles pass slowly, at the deliberate funeral pace of a hearse drawn by 4 black-draped horses that are never once permitted to move faster than a careful walk, and you find yourself riding near the rear of the column with your master, watching the countryside change almost imperceptibly as the morning wears on. The flat fen fields around Fotheringhay giving way gradually to slightly higher, drier ground as you near the cathedral town, larks going up singing from the stubble on either side of the road, as though entirely unaware of what's passing beneath them. Villagers turn out along the whole route to watch the procession go by, standing at field gates and cottage doors, most silent, a few crossing themselves quickly and covertly before catching themselves and dropping their hands. A gesture your master notices too. You can tell, from the careful way he keeps his own eyes fixed straight ahead and says nothing about it. You reach the outskirts of Peterborough by early afternoon, the August heat by now considerable, sweat gathering under your collar and along your spine beneath a shirt that has already gone from merely warm to properly uncomfortable, and the crowd waiting there to receive the procession is larger than anything you have ever seen gathered in one place in your whole short life, larger even than the crowd that turns out for the great October horse fair, larger than anything you imagined a cathedral town this size could possibly hold. They line the final approach to the Great West Front 3 and 4 deep, craning for a view, murmuring amongst themselves in a low continuous hum that rises and falls like wind through standing grain, and the bells of the cathedral itself begin tolling while the procession is still a good half-mile distant. A slow, heavy, deliberate peal that you feel as much as hear. A vibration that seems to travel up through the ground and into the soles of your boots. Your master finds you both a place near the edge of the churchyard wall, close enough to see clearly but well back from the carefully arranged ranks of official mourners who will actually process inside for the ceremony proper, and you stand there together in the crushing heat, pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers who smell of sweat and horse, and the particular mustiness of good black wool clothing that has been kept folded away in a chest for years, waiting for an occasion exactly like this one, and brought out now at last into a summer heat it was never designed to be worn in. You watch the coffin itself carried from the hearse on the shoulders of 6 men in mourning livery. The same heavy, ugly lead coffin you remember from that terrible first week, though it has been fitted now for this final journey, with an outer casing of black velvet studded with silver ornaments, so that it no longer looks like the plain, grim object your master helped seal, but something grander, something built for public ceremony rather than private grief. There is a strange dissonance in watching this transformation. The plain lead box you handled with your own hands, now dressed up in velvet and silver, for a public that never once saw the woman inside it, while she lived among them as anything other than a distant, dangerous rumour, and you find yourself thinking, standing there in the crushing heat, about how much of what a kingdom does with its dead has nothing at all to do with the dead themselves, and everything to do with what the living need the occasion to mean. Behind the coffin, walking on foot the last stretch into the cathedral close despite the heat, comes the household procession, and there, near the front of it, you see Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curl, both dressed in the deepest, heaviest mourning black you have ever seen 2 women wear, veiled, walking with a controlled, deliberate stillness that you recognize immediately as the same hard-won composure you watched Jane Kennedy build for herself, piece by piece, across the whole long spring in that walled garden behind the chapel. She does not look toward the crowd as she passes, does not seem to look at anything at all beyond the middle distance directly ahead of her, and you understand, watching her go by close enough to have reached out and touched her sleeve, that she has spent the better part of 6 months rehearsing exactly this walk in her mind, promising herself over and over that she will not weep in front of a crowd that has already taken everything else there was to take from the woman she served. She does not see you in the crowd. There is no reason she should, among so many hundreds of watching faces, and you do not try to catch her attention, understanding without needing to be told that this moment belongs entirely to her and to nobody else, least of all to a 15-year-old surgeon's apprentice she spoke to once kindly in a garden months ago. But you find yourself standing there watching her pass, silently wishing her some version of peace, whatever shape peace can possibly take for a woman who has just walked the final 12 miles of a journey that began, for her, on a scaffold in a locked hall back in February. The ceremony itself takes place inside the cathedral, behind walls too thick and doors too well guarded for anyone outside to hear or see more than the general shape of things, the bells, the long slow silence broken occasionally by the muffled sound of an organ, the eventual emergence, hours later, of the official mourners walking now with a different, looser quality to their movement. Whatever has been formerly required of them, finally, at last, discharged. You and your master waited out in the churchyard shade, sharing what's left of the vinegar water, saying very little, both of you, you suspect, thinking private thoughts about a night back in February that neither of you has ever properly discussed with the other beyond the barest practical necessities. It is nearly evening by the time the crowd finally begins to disperse, the August light going long and golden across the cathedral close, swifts wheeling and screaming overhead in the last of the day's heat, and you feel, standing there amid the slow-thinning crowd with your master beside you and 12 miles of dusty road still ahead of you, before either of you sees your own beds again, a strange sense of completion settling over the whole long chapter of the past half-year. She is, at last, in the ground. Whatever else this kingdom does or fails to do with her memory in the years to come, whatever bitter arguments the theologians and diplomats and pamphleteers continue to have about the rightness or wrongness of the whole business, whatever her son, sitting on his own throne up in Edinburgh, eventually decides to feel about a mother he never properly knew and a death he was powerless to prevent, she is finally, after 6 months of terrible limbo, allowed to rest. You learn, years later, long after your apprenticeship has ended, and you have set up your own modest practice in a neighbouring town, married, raised children of your own with hands that have finally, gradually, stopped feeling quite so young and untested, that her son James, having inherited the English throne as well as his own Scottish one some 16 years after that terrible February morning, ordered his mother's body exhumed from Peterborough and reburied with considerably greater honour at Westminster Abbey itself, in the very heart of the kingdom that had executed her, laid to rest not far from the tomb of the cousin who signed her death warrant. You think, hearing this news second-hand from a travelling pedlar, who has it from a cousin, who has it from someone who once served in the London household, about the strange, slow arc of it all. A woman executed in secret, buried in limbo, moved once to a cathedral far from any court, and moved again, decades later, into the very centre of the power that destroyed her, honoured at last by the son whose grief and whose politics had, in the end, worked out to roughly the same conclusion. You picture it, though you were never anywhere near London to see it with your own eyes. A new coffin, grander even than the velvet and silver casing they built for the journey to Peterborough, carried through the Abbey's great echoing spaces by men who never once, in their whole lives, laid eyes on the woman inside it, past 100 other tombs of kings and queens who spent their own lives locked in exactly the sort of quarrels that ended hers, and laid finally to rest under a marble effigy carved to show her as young and serene as she had not been permitted to look for the better part of 20 years of captivity. You think of the grey-cropped hair beneath that vanished wig, and the marble face above the new tomb carved smooth and untroubled, and you understand, by now old enough to understand such things properly, that the two images will never entirely reconcile themselves in your mind, and that this too is simply part of what it means to have been present, once, briefly, at the raw and unglamorous beginning of a story that the rest of the world would spend centuries afterward smoothing into something far more comfortable to look at. Your own life, in the meantime, goes on accumulating its own ordinary weight of years. You finish your apprenticeship under Master Ashby some 3 years after that terrible February, and he sets you up, with a generosity you have never entirely felt you deserved, in a small practice of your own in a neighbouring market town a day's ride distant, close enough that you visit him regularly until the illness that finally takes him, gently in his own bed, surrounded by people who love him, the death he always deserved, and that so few people in his own strange trade are ever actually granted. You marry in time a baker's daughter with flour permanently worked into the creases of her knuckles, the way spice was once worked into yours, and you raise 3 children who grow up thinking of their father as a solid, unremarkable, reliably competent man of medicine, entirely unaware that he once spent a single terrible night wrapping a queen's body by candlelight and came away from it, carrying, ever since, one small, dark secret pressed against his ribs. You take on your own apprentice, eventually a quick, nervous boy named Peter, with exactly the kind of raw, chapped knuckles you remember so well from your own first winter in this trade, and you find yourself teaching him the careful mixing of plasters and the proper grinding of simples, repeating almost word for word certain phrases your own master once gave you. Steady hands, a shut mouth, and the understanding that a decision made in the space of a single breath is worth something, only if you can say the reason for it aloud to your own conscience without flinching from the sound. You never do anything with the bead. That's perhaps the strangest part of the whole story, looking back on it from the vantage of an old man's memory rather than a boy's raw and immediate feeling. You keep it through every move of your working life, through the ordinary accumulation of years that turns a 15-year-old apprentice with chapped knuckles into a grown surgeon with his own apprentices, his own shop, his own small collection of quiet secrets that nobody else in the world knows to ask him about. You keep it in a small box eventually, once the seam of that particular coat wears through and needs replacing, and you take it out from time to time on nights when sleep won't quite come, and turn it over between fingers that have grown considerably steadier and considerably more scarred than they were on the night you first held it, and you think about a room full of candlelight and a crimson petticoat chosen weeks in advance, and a small dog too loyal to leave a body even after everything that made it worth being loyal to had already gone. You never tell your own children the whole of the story. Not properly, not while you're alive to see their reactions to it. Some things, you come to understand, are not made lighter by sharing them, only made into a different kind of weight, passed from one set of hands to another, and you find in your old age that you would rather carry this particular weight alone, quietly, the way you have carried it since you were 15 years old and reached out, without entirely understanding why, to save one small true thing from a fire that would otherwise have taken absolutely everything. Centuries will pass, and the castle at Fotheringhay will fall gradually into ruin, its stones eventually carried off by local builders for other purposes entirely, until almost nothing remains on that low rise above the flat fields to mark the spot where any of this happened at all. The cathedral at Peterborough will stand, and Westminster Abbey will stand, and travellers from countries that did not even exist in 1587 will walk past a queen's tomb in that great abbey without the faintest idea of the 6-month limbo, the sealed lead coffin, the crimson petticoat, the loyal dog, the small dark bead pressed into the coat seam of a frightened 15-year-old apprentice who happened, purely by the accident of his master's trade, to be present at the exact moment when history and grief and quiet, unwitnessed decency all occupied the same small cold room at the same terrible hour. But some things don't change, whatever else the centuries carry away with them. The particular ache of chapped hands doing careful work in a cold room, that doesn't change. The instinct to save one small true thing from a fire, determined to take everything, that doesn't change either. And the simple, private comfort of finally being allowed to rest, after however long a limbo the living have seen fit to impose upon you, That, too, is a thing every single person listening to this story, whatever century they happen to be falling asleep in, will eventually come to understand for themselves, in their own way, in their own time. So let it come the way it came for you at the end of that longest of years, on a cold stone floor, and then a walled garden, and then a churchyard full of tolling bells. Let the weight of everything you've carried today settle finally into something you can set down for the night without fear of it catching fire while you sleep. Let the room grow quiet around you, the candles gutter, the small persistent ache in your hands ease at last into stillness. Let your thoughts slow and soften, and finally stop turning over the same small dark bead again and again, and instead simply rest, here, now, safe, in a bed that nobody's going to summon you out of before dawn. You've carried enough for tonight. Let someone else carry it for a while. Good night.